Welcome, the anointed ones. The truth doesn't need permission to arrive, it just needs someone brave enough to recognize it before the crowd does. They said you were paranoid. They called you dramatic, too intense, too into your head. Funny how no one's laughing now, except maybe you, sipping tea while watching the very thing you warned them about crash in slow motion. Here's the plot twist they didn't see coming. You weren't predicting the future. You were just the only one paying attention. In 2014, researchers at Princeton found that social groups often reject accurate early warnings simply because the truth is inconvenient. Translation: the messenger gets mocked while the lie gets liked. So when everything fell apart, the community gasped in shock like it was a plot twist. But you'd already seen the trailer, read the script, and circled the red flags in highlighter. Welcome to the story of the chosen ones, the misunderstood, the misread, the misquoted, but never mistaken. Let's talk about how you knew before the mask slipped. Because it wasn't luck. It was discernment in a world addicted to denial. Number one, you didn't just feel it, you decoded it. You didn't just feel something was off, you decoded it. While everyone else was brushing things off, distracted by surface-level smiles and sweet talk, you were reading the deeper signals. The tone behind their words, the pauses in their stories, the shift in their energy when the topic changed. You were listening to what wasn't being said, watching for signs in their patterns, not their performance. Most people miss it because they're conditioned to accept what looks right. If someone's confident enough, loud enough, charming enough, they get a pass. But not with you. You've always been the one who notices when the puzzle pieces don't really fit, even when everyone's pretending they do. It's not paranoia, it's pattern recognition. You've been through enough, seen enough, and lost enough to know when something's off, even if you can't explain it right away. And because of that, you didn't just predict what would happen. You understood why it would. You weren't guessing. You were observing, collecting, and connecting dots that everyone else thought were just background noise. What made it worse? You couldn't always say it out loud, because the moment you did, people looked at you like you were the problem, like you were the one creating drama, when in reality, you were the only one not asleep at the wheel. It's frustrating watching others fall for the mask while you're standing there, fully aware of what's underneath it. You saw the storm building way before the clouds even showed. But here's the thing. What used to feel like a burden is now your power. You weren't meant to follow the herd. You were meant to spot the danger before the stampede. And now, as everything unravels, people are starting to connect the same dots you did. But too late. You were never lucky or psychic, you were just aware. And that awareness, that's what separates the chosen from the crowd. Number two, you were ridiculed until reality matched your vision. They laughed at you, not just behind your back, sometimes to your face. The eye rolls, the sarcastic replies, the subtle digs wrapped in jokes. You spoke your truth, and they acted like you were reaching, exaggerating, making something out of nothing. But deep down, they felt it too. They just weren't ready to confront it, so they made you the target instead. Easier to mock the messenger than face the message. You weren't chasing clout or attention. You weren't trying to be some prophet. You were just bold enough to say what everyone else was too scared to admit. That something was wrong, that things didn't add up, that behind the hype and the polished image there were cracks, real ones. But when you said it out loud, it made people uncomfortable. And when people get uncomfortable, they laugh, not because it's funny, but because denial is louder than truth at first. But then the shift came, slowly, quietly. The very things you pointed out started becoming impossible to ignore. One by one, they started seeing what you saw. And suddenly, those same people who laughed, they stopped making jokes. They got real quiet. Not because they owed you an apology, but because they were now standing in the very storm you warned them about. That's the part they don't talk about. How the joke stops being funny when it becomes your reality. The hardest part? You never wanted to be right. You weren't hoping for chaos. You just refused to stay blind. You chose honesty over acceptance, clarity over comfort. And that decision made you the odd one out, until it made you the one who saw it first. That's what separates you. You didn't wait for proof to be popular. You trusted your gut, stood on what you knew, and let time do the talking. Being laughed at is temporary, but being proven right, that echoes. Number 3. You didn't want to be right. You just refused to be blind. You didn't speak up because you wanted to win an argument. You spoke up because you couldn't ignore what your gut was screaming. You weren't hoping to be right. You just couldn't lie to yourself like everyone else was doing. While others were clinging to the story they wanted to believe, you were brave enough to accept what was actually happening. And that kind of clarity, it's uncomfortable. It isolates you. But it's real. People think it's easy to see the truth. It's not. It costs you comfort, relationships, and sometimes even your peace. Because once you see something for what it is, there's no going back. You can't pretend anymore. You can't unnotice the shady behavior, the fake loyalty, the twisted narratives. And when you try to point it out, it's like you're ruining the party. You become the negative one, the too serious one, the person who overthinks everything. But in reality, you're just the one who stopped pretending. You weren't looking to be a hero or a leader. You were just refusing to be blind. That's what made you dangerous to them. Because people invested in a lie will do anything to silence the one person who sees the truth. It's not about disagreement, it's about control. And you broke the script. You saw through the performance, and that threatened the whole act. The craziest part is that you didn't even want this role. You didn't want to call things out. You didn't want the friction or the backlash. You just couldn't sit quietly while things got worse. And that's what separates you. While everyone else stayed silent to protect the illusion, you were willing to lose comfort for clarity. That's not ego, that's integrity. You weren't trying to be right. You were trying not to lie to yourself. And in a world built on denial, that alone makes you rare. Number 4. You felt the vibe rot before the fall came. You felt the shift way before the collapse. Not because someone told you, and not because of some dramatic event, but because the energy changed. The excitement that used to feel real started to feel forced. The smiles got tighter. The praise felt performative. The room wasn't alive anymore. It was on life support, and no one wanted to admit it. But you felt it. Every moment that was supposed to be inspiring started to feel hollow. Something was off, and no one else wanted to say it out loud. You weren't being negative. You were being honest. While everyone else was busy posting highlights and pretending everything was thriving, you were already grieving what it used to be. You had already watched the passion fade, the authenticity drain out, the realness disappear. And when the inevitable downfall came, you didn't flinch. You'd already gone through the emotional process quietly in your own space, long before the public unraveling. It's wild how long people can keep applauding something that's clearly decaying. They don't want to admit they've been following a ghost, so they keep cheering, hoping the noise will cover the cracks. But you saw it, you felt it, and instead of waiting for the explosion, you stepped back and started letting go, not out of bitterness but out of clarity. You knew what was coming because the signs weren't hidden. They were just inconvenient. You learned to stop arguing. You stopped trying to warn people who were in love with the illusion. You let them celebrate the shell while you were already processing the end. And when it finally crumbled, you weren't surprised. You were calm. Not because you didn't care, but because you'd already said goodbye. That's the part people never understand about being aware early. You carry the weight of the ending before anyone else is ready to accept it. And when it finally hits, they're in shock. And you're just standing there, already healed. Number 5. You stopped talking because you knew it would be used against you. You didn't go quiet because you had nothing to say. You went quiet because you knew too much. You saw how people twisted your words, clipped your truth, and flipped it into something it was never meant to be. Every time you tried to speak with honesty, it got repackaged into drama, bitterness, or ego. So eventually, you chose silence, not out of fear, but out of strategy. You knew your truth wasn't safe in their hands. Not because it wasn't valid, but because they weren't ready for it. They didn't want clarity. They wanted something to use. And you realized that no matter how carefully you explained yourself, they'd only hear what fit their narrative. They weren't listening to understand. They were listening to weaponize. So you stopped explaining. You stopped trying to defend what you knew was real. And that silence, it wasn't weakness. It was your way of taking back control. You chose to let your actions, your peace, and eventually the outcomes speak for you. Because there's a point where protecting your truth means keeping it close, not offering it up to people who only want to tear it apart. People noticed when you went quiet. They thought you had nothing left. They assumed you'd given up. What they didn't realize was that your silence was louder than any rant could be. It was the moment you stopped asking to be understood and started preparing for the storm you knew was coming. And when it finally came, you weren't caught off guard. You were already built for it. That's what they'll never understand. You weren't hiding. You were preserving. You were protecting something sacred from being tainted. Because truth in the wrong hands becomes gossip. But truth kept in the right heart, that becomes power. And you've been holding yours quietly, patiently, knowing that when the dust settles, silence always proves louder than noise. And number 6, you were too early for their timeline. You weren't wrong, you were just early. Your timing didn't fail. You just landed in a room that wasn't ready to hear what you had to say. And when people aren't ready, they reject what challenges them. Not because it's false, but because it's too real, too raw, too soon. You spoke from a place of clarity, and they responded with resistance, not because you were off, but because your truth outpaced their comfort. You showed them a glimpse of what was coming, but it clashed with the version of reality they were still trying to hold on to, so they labeled you difficult, dramatic, overthinking. They needed time to arrive at the same realization you already lived through. But instead of listening, they tried to shut you down, hoping to delay the discomfort. You became a problem simply because your clarity arrived before theirs. It's hard being ahead of the curve. It feels lonely. You end up questioning yourself, not because you doubt the truth, but because everyone around you acts like you're seeing something that isn't there. But deep down, you know what you're sensing is real. You can feel the shift before it becomes visible. You recognize the pattern before it becomes undeniable. That's not guessing, that's alignment, that's discernment, that's vision. And here's the part they'll never say out loud. A lot of them heard you the first time. They just weren't ready to act on it. They needed more comfort, more applause, more delay. So instead of honoring your voice, they tried to bury it under doubt. But time always exposes what people weren't ready to accept. Now, they're catching up, quietly revisiting your words, secretly admitting you were right. But you don't need validation anymore. You've already moved past the need to be believed on their timeline. Because the truth doesn't expire. It waits. And yours? It's been sitting there patiently while the rest of the room catches up to where you've already been. Number 7. You were the lighthouse. They called a fire. You weren't trying to cause chaos. You were trying to prevent it. But when you stood up and pointed out what was coming, they didn't see a warning. They saw a threat. They mistook your light for destruction because it shined too directly on everything they didn't want to deal with. The cracks, the flaws, the fake unity, the unspoken tension. You exposed it, not out of malice, but out of necessity. But instead of thanking you, they called you the problem. You were the lighthouse. You saw the storm and tried to guide them away from it, but they were too comfortable drifting, too committed to the illusion of safety. And when your truth cut through the fog, they panicked, because once you see clearly, you can't pretend anymore. That's what scared them. Not you, but the clarity you brought with you. They said you were being negative, dramatic, disruptive. In reality, you were the only one with the courage to say what everyone else was silently feeling. But because you broke the code of silence, they treated you like the enemy, not realizing that you were the only one trying to keep the ship from sinking. It's a lonely thing, being the one who sees the danger first. You get blamed for the tension, even though you didn't cause it. You just refuse to ignore it. And when the collapse finally happens, people act shocked. But you'd already sounded the alarm. You were never trying to tear it down. You were trying to save it before it was too late. Now they see it. The fire they accused you of starting wasn't yours. It was already burning. They just didn't want to see the smoke. And when the truth finally broke through, it became clear. You weren't the threat. You were the only warning they had. The only one who stood up before the silence turned into rubble. Number 8. You watched loyalty become leverage. You watched loyalty turn into a bargaining chip. What started as trust and shared purpose slowly became strategy. People weren't standing by each other because they believed in the mission. They were staying close because it was beneficial, safe, profitable. And when the tides shifted, so did their alliances, not out of growth or realization, but out of sheer convenience. You saw it happening in real time. They called it evolution, but you saw the truth. It was opportunism. When it served them, they were loyal. When it didn't, they rewrote their values and pretended they had outgrown what they were once clapping for. You could feel the change in their tone, the way they started speaking in half-truths and vague support, keeping just enough distance to jump ship if things got too real. That wasn't growth. That was positioning. You didn't need proof to see the betrayal coming. You could read it in the shift of their energy, the delays in their responses, the way they suddenly became neutral in moments that required conviction. You noticed how loyalty became performative, used to maintain appearances or protect access. It wasn't about integrity anymore. It was about alignment with power. The hardest part? You couldn't call it out without being painted as paranoid or bitter. So you stayed quiet and watched. Not because you were okay with it, but because you knew time would do the revealing. And it did. One by one, people showed their real motivations, not in how they supported you when things were good, but in how quickly they disappeared when standing with you became inconvenient. That's what cuts the deepest. Not the betrayal itself, but the realization that some people were never loyal to you, just loyal to their comfort. And when that comfort was threatened, so was their loyalty. You didn't lose them. They were never really there to begin with. You just caught them before the mask slipped all the way off. Number 9, you realized the community was a costume party. At first it looked like unity, like a collective of people moving with purpose, supporting each other, building something real. But the longer you stayed, the more the seams started to show. The support felt rehearsed. The praise came too quickly, too easily, and only when the spotlight was involved. What was being sold as community was really a stage, a performance, and everyone had a role to play. You started to see how the love was transactional, how people weren't celebrated for their integrity but for their influence. It wasn't about truth, it was about trend. The loudest voices weren't the wisest, just the most marketable. Relationships were built not on trust, but on exposure. You realized that being authentic had less value than being visible. You didn't change. You just stopped pretending you didn't see it. You noticed how the tribe only showed up when it was profitable to do so. How collaboration was less about connection and more about clout. And if you didn't play the game, you were left on read, talked around, or quietly pushed out. Not because you were wrong, but because you didn't wear the costume. That's when it hit you. It wasn't a community. It was a marketplace dressed up as one. Loyalty had a price tag. Praise came with strings. And the moment you stopped serving the illusion, you became invisible. Not because you lost your value, but because you stopped fitting the script. It stung at first, watching people you once believed in trade authenticity for access. But then came the clarity. You didn't belong because you weren't for sale. You weren't willing to pretend. And in a room full of performers, realness will always be too loud. So you stepped back, not bitter, just done. You saw through the glitter and recognized the plastic. What looked like a tribe was just well-dressed isolation. And while they keep dancing in sync, you've chosen truth over choreography. Number 10. You outgrew their narrative without apologizing. They had a version of you that worked for their comfort, a version that stayed small, agreeable, predictable. The role they assigned you served their narrative. You were supposed to stay in your place, nod at the right moments, and never disrupt the image they built around you. But then you started growing, quietly at first, asking different questions, thinking deeper, moving differently, and that growth didn't fit their storyline. You weren't rebellious, you were just evolving. But to them, your evolution felt like defiance. It threatened the dynamics they counted on. Because the moment you stopped shrinking, they couldn't control the plot anymore. They couldn't box you into the role that made them feel bigger, wiser, more in control. You outgrew the character they wrote for you, And you didn't ask for permission or explain yourself. That's what really upset them. They needed you to keep playing along so the story stayed clean. So they could be the leader, the victim, the savior, whatever role they were attached to. But your truth complicated things. Your self-respect rewrote the script, and instead of celebrating your clarity, they distanced themselves. Not because you changed for the worse, but because you changed in ways they couldn't manage. You chose not to apologize for evolving. You didn't tone it down to keep their comfort intact. You didn't beg for understanding or shrink back into old patterns just to be accepted. And that quiet refusal, that was your power. You didn't need a big announcement. You just stopped bending. You stopped editing yourself for people who only loved you when you were easier to handle. And now they're uncomfortable with your growth. Not because it's wrong, but because it reminds them of where they've stayed stuck. But you're not shrinking again to make them feel better. You outgrew the old story, and you're not sorry for it. You're just done living in chapters that no longer fit who you've become. Number 11. You witnessed ego masquerading as leadership. You watched it unfold like a perfectly rehearsed play. On the surface, it looked like leadership, bold words, confident moves, the applause of a room echoing after every sentence. But underneath it all, you saw what most people missed. It wasn't leadership. It was ego in costume. Every decision, every speech, every so-called vision was less about guiding others and more about feeding the image. It wasn't about serving, it was about being seen. You noticed how charisma became currency, how the louder someone spoke, the more people assumed they had depth. But when you really listened, there was no foundation, just recycled sound bites and carefully crafted performances. The influence they held wasn't earned through trust or truth. It was maintained through control. They didn't empower people. They surrounded themselves with those who wouldn't challenge them. You saw how mentorship turned into manipulation, how loyalty was rewarded only if it didn't come with questions, how disagreement wasn't met with dialogue, but with exile. People were kept close, not because they were valued, but because they were useful. And when they weren't, they were discarded or discredited, quietly but intentionally. What looked like an empire was really a house of mirrors, every reflection distorted to serve one narrative. You could feel the fear in the room, the fear of saying too much, asking the wrong question, stepping out of line. But instead of playing along, you watched, and what you saw couldn't be unseen. The hardest part was realizing how many others did see it, but stayed silent. Because the illusion was comfortable, and calling it out came with a cost. But you weren't built to worship titles or follow smoke. You recognized the difference between presence and performance, between influence and integrity. And once you knew the truth, there was no pretending. You didn't expose them. You didn't need to. Ego always does that on its own. All you did was stop clapping. And in a space built on applause, that was the loudest truth of all. Number 12. You learned the difference between watchers and warriors. You thought they were with you. The way they nodded, the way they hovered close when things got loud, the way they reposted your wins like they were part of the story. But when things got heavy, when the stakes rose, when truth stopped being trendy, you saw the line. And suddenly, those allies weren't standing beside you. They were standing back, watching. You learned the difference in silence. Warriors speak up, stand up, lean in. Watchers just observe. They cheer when it's safe, when it benefits them, when it looks good. But the second things get uncomfortable, they disappear into the crowd. And not because they didn't see what was happening. They did. They just didn't want to be associated with the fallout. They didn't want to lose proximity to power or risk being seen as too much. They liked your courage, but only when it didn't cost them anything. They liked your truth, but only when it was wrapped in something soft and digestible. The moment you stopped performing and started pushing back, they froze. No support, no cover, just quiet scrolling, private messages, and public distance. And that's when you got clear. There are people who want change, and there are people who want a show. The watchers love a good rebellion until it requires their name on it, until it makes things messy, until it shines a light on their passivity. Warriors don't flinch when things get hard. They step forward. They risk their name, their comfort, their silence. Watchers. They take notes for later. They consume the moment, then pretend they were never there. It hurt, but it helped. Because now you know who's real. Not everyone who claps is committed. Not everyone who shows up is showing up. You stopped confusing presence with partnership. You learned that not everyone in the crowd is rooting for you. Some are just waiting for the crash. But you're not here to perform. You're here to build. And builders don't need spectators. They need warriors. Number 13. You didn't predict the collapse. You understood the foundation. You weren't guessing. You weren't hoping for things to fail. You simply understood what others didn't bother to look at, the foundation. While most people were distracted by the shine, the momentum, the noise, you were paying attention to the structure, not the surface-level hype, but the choices being made behind the scenes, the motives, the inconsistencies, the things that didn't add up if you stopped clapping long enough to think. People confuse momentum with stability all the time. Just because something's moving doesn't mean it's solid. You saw how the success was being built on fragile egos, silenced voices, performative unity, and unspoken tension. You noticed how the louder the branding got, the more hollow the values became. And while everyone else celebrated the image, you were tracing the blueprint, spotting the shortcuts and missing supports. The collapse didn't surprise you because it was never about a single moment. It was the result of a pattern. A culture of denial, a refusal to deal with real problems because fixing them would mean confronting uncomfortable truths, so instead they kept building, taller, flashier, faster, all while pretending they didn't hear the creaking underneath. But you did. You heard it in every forced smile, every avoided question, every just stay positive used to shut down dissent. You weren't negative, you were grounded. You knew that anything built on avoidance eventually pays for it. And the louder they ignored the warning signs, the more certain you became of the fall. Not because you wanted it, but because you saw it coming in the blueprint. It was already written into the structure. Now that it's crumbling, people are scrambling for answers, but you've already moved past shock. You've been carrying the truth they're just now confronting. And it's not about being right. It's about being real enough to see what they couldn't, and brave enough not to lie to yourself about it. Number 14. You didn't need closure. You needed confirmation. You weren't chasing closure. You weren't waiting by the door hoping they'd come back and explain, apologize, or make things right. That was never the point. What you really wanted, quietly, deeply, was confirmation. Not from them, but from time, from life, from truth doing what it always does, surfacing when no one's pretending anymore. You already knew what happened. You felt the shift long before it was spoken. The cold energy, the performative loyalty, the sudden distance dressed up as space. You saw through the performances and polite lies. What you didn't do was argue. You didn't plead your case or drag it into the light for validation. Because that's the part they never understood. You weren't after being right. You were after being free. And freedom came when you realized closure is often a trap. A way to keep you tethered to stories that already wrote their ending. You stopped trying to get answers from people who were busy rewriting the past in their favor. You stepped back, not in weakness, but in quiet power. You knew the truth had a timeline of its own, and eventually it would show up. You didn't need someone to come back with clarity. You just needed to know you weren't crazy, that what you felt was real. That your instincts weren't drama, your questions weren't overthinking, and your boundaries weren't betrayal. You weren't broken, you were just ahead of the unveiling. And now, the truth is speaking, slowly, silently, in the ways people unravel themselves. You're seeing it all without lifting a finger. No forced conversations, no dramatic reveals, just life peeling back the layers. And what's showing up confirms everything you once questioned. You didn't get closure, you got confirmation. And in the end, that was the only thing you ever needed. They called you intense, dramatic, too much. But you were never too much. You were just awake in a room full of people still sleeping in their comfort. You weren't reacting, you were reading. Reading the silences, the energy shifts, the truths buried under applause. While others waited for impact, you were already bracing for the fall because you saw it coming in the way things were built. And now, the masks are off. The illusion has faded. What once looked unshakable has crumbled under its own weight, and the whispers you once carried alone have become echoes in rooms that finally understand. You were never after revenge or recognition. All you ever wanted was for truth to walk in without needing you to drag it. You weren't bitter. You were early. You weren't divisive. You were clear. You didn't outgrow people out of pride. You outgrew the performance they needed you to stay small in. And that's the real story here, not the fall, but your refusal to fold just to keep others comfortable in fiction. So stand tall, not with arrogance, but with peace, because you never needed a stage. You were the signal, the proof, the warning. And now, the story you've lived through becomes the blueprint for others waking up. You weren't the storm, you were the forecast. And you didn't just survive it, you saw it, named it, and rose through it. That's not luck, that's legacy. If this message hit home, if it made you pause, reflect, or feel seen, don't just scroll on like the video so it reaches the ones still in the fog. Drop a comment, your story, your moment of clarity, or just if you're walking in truth now. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already, because this space isn't built for the crowd, it's built for the called. And if you know someone who needs this, share it, loudly, quietly. Doesn't matter, just make sure it finds who it's meant for. This is more than content, it's confirmation, and we're just getting started. God bless you.